In this video, what we're going to do is see how we can create some detailed beveled text. Now, this type of text is used a lot in different movie titles, something like Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, that type of stuff. But a lot of the things we're going to be covering are also the same as if you were going to be creating like a knife, an axe, or something with a blade. So we'll go through the creation of the text, the modeling, as well as a bit of the materials because that can help as well. So let's go ahead and get started. As you can see, we have some nice beveled text that we were able to add some detail to. Now, this detail can be added through sculpting, through deformers. It really is up to you. And also the material is playing a part in this, helping to highlight the edge here. So let's go ahead and kind of start from scratch. We don't have to start with a completely new scene, but yeah, there's a little bit of it more close up. Can hide the final version. And I'm going to start by just creating some text here. Now, there is actually a Harry Potter font that you can find online. I think I got it at DeFonts, but I'm not 100% certain. It was free. And so that's what we're going to be starting with. So I apologize if my fonts are off screen here, but I believe it's just called like Harry P. So there we go. And yeah, we're able to get something that looks pretty good, pretty similar to what you might expect for Harry Potter, very quickly and easily. And honestly, to get a simple beveled text, it actually isn't too difficult. I was a bit surprised how well this worked by just going into the cap section here and just increasing the size until we ran out, and then just lowering the segments to 1. And you can see we actually have something pretty similar here. Now, really, I don't know why I'm in the sculpt layout here, so let's switch to standard. But actually, I don't want to render this, want to show the lines. A lot of the process and what I'm going to be covering is going over how to make this text workable when it comes to, say, sculpting and working with deformers, because text that you create using the text object, text spline, and an extrude is essentially the same thing, is not very workable. Ideally, what we're looking for here are 4-sided polygons, and you can see, we have quite a few of those, but we end up with quite a few n-gons as well, especially on these areas, but also polygons that are about the same size. And if I just bring back my final text here, we can kind of compare that a little bit. I'll get rid of the sculpt tag. You can see, that is something that, is quite different about these, is that we have pretty much 4-sided polygons everywhere, the occasional triangle, which isn't the end of the world. And I tried to make the polygons about the same size. Now, there's definitely more work I could do for that, but I definitely wanted to highlight that. So let's go dive in here and kind of see how we can go about this. And this is where this turns into a little bit more of a detailed modeling tutorial. I'm going to make the text editable by hitting the letter C. We end up with our extrudes here. And, the P actually works pretty well. Primarily 4-sided polygons. We could go through and maybe make things more the same size. We do have a few n-gons here we may want to clean up, but I'm really going to be focusing on the H as, that's where the majority of the issues are. And, really once you understand the H, it's going to be pretty easy to apply this to the P or really any other kind of text, because obviously there are plenty of other uses for this. I think you've seen this text a lot kind of in movie titles, Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, that type of stuff. But it can be used in other situations as well to create axes, knives, swords, that type of thing. And I want to highlight that, you might initially think that this is a pretty easy thing to fix. I thought it, or I hoped it would be, and if it had, I'm not sure I would have made a video about it. But, my first thought here was to put it into a remesh and to kind of go about it this way. And you can see that really didn't work. And I played around with this a little bit. I won't do it too much, but I initially thought maybe the mesh density would help. Working with the hard edges helps a little bit. We could work with our Phong angle here as well to kind of help. And we're starting to get pretty close, right? And in fact, this is actually not bad at all but it does give us some other things that would require fixing. So, there can be a number of approaches to this. This might have been a little bit easier with using such a high mesh density, but we still have some problem areas. And I will say the one thing this did very well is make polygons that are more similar in size. Those will subdivide better. If you were to put it into a subdivision surface, you can see that works, pretty darn well if you just need something a little bit softer, but you can see we still have some problems. And that's something that, when we do this ourselves, we have a little bit more control over. So, the remesh can help get you a bit closer. You might initially think that working with the intermediate points type can help. And, once again, depending on the font, the circumstance, the letters, it's possible it could. Right now we have our points type set to adaptive, and that's why we have so many points around the curve here and not very many in the straight areas. If you were to switch this to, say, natural, you see we do get a little bit more equal distribution. But the problem with this is it can be harder to make this into four-sided polygons, because you'll see how these don't really line up anymore. Now, once again, depending on how much work you want to put in or how comfortable you are, kind of slicing and dicing up a mesh, this could work. I do like the fact that we have lines here vertically as well as some horizontally. That's something I really didn't have in the finished part, and does make things a little bit trickier when it comes to adding edge loops. So that could potentially work. Uniform really isn't going to work, since it's going to give us, the same number here, but we have some issues with our corners. And so you kind of have to just pick your battles. For this, I just kept this at adaptive and essentially just made it editable. And I'm not going to go through kind of every single part of this, because it does get very repetitive. But what I'll do is kind of go over the main parts here, and hopefully that will be enough to kind of get you going. I don't want to make this too long, too boring, or too repetitive. So here we have our letter H. We can get rid of the P, because like I said, that's, very far along in terms of four-sided polygons and whatnot. And really there were kind of two parts I wanted to focus on. One of the tops here, and then, one of the sides. What I will say in the final one is I actually started with this top, made one, and then just kind of copied it out here and replaced it, so I didn't have to clean up all four of these. Another thing we can do to kind of help speed things up is get rid of the bottom. I can either use symmetry if the bottom is going to be visible, or, in the case of the simple scene I had set up, we didn't see it at all. So I can just get rid of those polygons, and that's going to be fewer things I'm going to see from, say, a top view, and make my life a little bit easier. And I do primarily work in a top view with this, but it is important to check our other views, because things can get a little bit weird if we're snapping and sliding, which are really two of the main tools we'll be using, along with, line cut, optimize a little bit, those types of modeling tools. And so the first thing I did was try to see if one of these looked a little bit better than the other. This one looks pretty good in terms of the number of edges and points kind of matching. This one looks pretty good too. So either one of these, I think, could work well. We'll start with the top one. And so the first thing I did was just kind of line cut across to start to subdivide this. Now, I should also mention I do have snap-on. That makes this process a little bit easier. And so I used line cut, shortcut key MK or KK, and I'm just kind of snapping that. I'm hitting spacebar to toggle back to my rectangular selection tool, spacebar again to toggle back to my line cut tool, and I'm just doing that back and forth to kind of do this. I'm not worried about them being even or anything like that yet. There isn't a great way to do that, or at least that I'm familiar with. Oh no. And so, darn it, we ended up with one extra there. So shoot, it ends up working pretty well. And this is something else that, you really will run into from time to time. It's just things aren't going to always work out. And so ultimately I could decide to just get rid of that extra edge, and I would want to switch to my perspective view to make sure I can get rid of, oh, that's interesting. We have that one extra polygon there, but this edge as well. And with this, I'm going to dissolve it. So I can right click, find dissolve, shortcut key MN, dissolve that, and then get rid of that extra polygon. I'm not sure how that survived, but it's now gone. Back to our top view. And we did change the shape a little bit of this, which is potentially a problem, but we also want to consider how close we're going to be. If we end up this close to our model, then yeah, it's probably going to be noticeable. But as we're further out, it becomes less and less noticeable with however many edges we have. So I think we can get away with it. Now, at this point, what I did was I just kind of zoomed in a bit here and said, all right, I'm going to use my grid to help me with this. And so, interesting, the grid spacing looks a bit different. Oh, there we go, than what I had before. So I just started with one side and I used slide, which is all the way down to the bottom here, MO, and selected that, turned on slide MO, and just said, okay, maybe this one will be even with that grid point. Came down here and said, maybe this one will be even with this grid point, and just worked my way down. In this case, I'm using every 2. It's not, I'm not being perfect, and sliding here is going to allow us to preserve a lot of the original curvature. Now we are going to change the shape a little bit. Okay. But once again, it probably isn't going to be noticeable. So I'm not terribly concerned about it. And that looks like I did that. And we can maybe do the same thing over here. Just make sure we kind of start with this lined up. I think this one was right there. Yeah. Maybe. Nope. Actually turns out it was this one. Okay. And do the same thing. Okay. Hopefully I end up doing this right and not getting like one off. That would be very problematic. And this is where some of the repetitiveness of this, doing something like this comes into play. So I'm trying to do this as quickly as possible. I feel like I definitely got off here somehow because, no, maybe not. Yeah. So 2, 2. This one is 2. That is 2. And this is 2. Great. So that looks like we're good. I could always use, I think I have, if I was to get out of here, something like a guide tool to be able to check if I really wanted to, if something is perfectly straight. It looks like, did I get it? Am I off? Let's see. Turn on our lines here. And no, well, it looks like it just didn't snap to the point there. So, okay, good. That guide looks like I did get it correct. And then at this point, I would need to work with the interior points here. Now, a reason why slide is important, I kind of glanced over it earlier, is because, we have things at different heights here. And so as you slide, right, if I just come back here and do slide, MO, notice how it's preserving the angle or curvature, just like we saw how I was trying to preserve it, from a top view here. But that's a big part of why we're doing this. If I just selected move and move this, you can see how, it starts to cause some issues. So that's the whole purpose of using slide and why it's important. And a big part of what we're doing here is really just trying to equally distribute these points. We want the polygons to be the same size. I know I've already said that, but I do mean it. So I'm going to come back here into my lines, and I'll notice that I did forget to kind of move the bottom ones, right? So these points as well. So that's unfortunate, but those go pretty quick. I can use my snap tool here to just snap this. And if you haven't worked with lines or wireframe, it can be a bit confusing, but let's see, where does this one go? Right there. Definitely would have been much easier if I did this. And this is another reason why you want to check multiple views as you're working so that you can. Oh, that looks like I might have moved the wrong one there. And interesting. So I did get a little bit off. 2, 2, 2, 2. So let's just come back here and we'll slide. So sorry, I keep doing it towards the bottom and it not showing. Something like that. Great. Back into our line view. Now I can see it's this point. I want to come in snap right there. And definitely need to do the same thing over here. It should be this one. This goes right there. And I can tell where it goes just based on where the edges are, right? And the shape it's giving me. So actually there is a little one right here. There we go. It actually is going a bit faster because instead of having to toggle between slide and, move, I'm able to do this. So this one actually goes here. This one, I think, goes down here. And then this one here. But as we saw, I need to move that up one. I suppose I could have left it since it was even, but since I've already done it on one side, it is something I'm going to have to do on this side. So that goes there, roughly. Like I said, I'm not being 100% precise with this. I don't think it's necessary. And yeah, now we get to move the interior points, and this is where using the grid, which I honestly don't do too much, is going to help, because that will very quickly allow me to see if I've got things correct. And if you wanted to spend more time making this even, you could. And I don't necessarily need to make this go straight across. In fact, it probably help with creating edge loops if I didn't. But I did do this on my final, so I thought I would do the same thing here. So let's see, this one should be there. And this is where it kind of starts to go together, right? So pretty straightforward at this point, a lot of the same process. And we are just about done with one of these top parts. And like I said, you could either copy this. Let's see. I think this one's supposed to be right there. And this one, need to zoom in a little bit, right about there. So that looks pretty good. Okay, and then what I would do is just add one more line cut to give me a way to kind of chop this off and place it on the other. So we'll just pretend like I did that. And now we're left with this, this side here. And, this is pretty similar to what we just did. What I'm going to do is try and just find points that look like they belong together and weld them together. Now you could also just slide them because it will stop, but then we do need to make sure we go back in and weld after. Now we're not going to have one for every single point here, and that's okay because we can either get rid of a point or edge or add a new one. And while slide is nice here, weld can also be helpful because it can allow me to decide which one I want to keep a little bit better. So I think this one should go there. Like this one, I know makes sense for it to go there. This one can go here. And yeah, for some of these, I'm going to have to add, same with these as well. But we can just kind of clean things up a little bit here. And honestly, what we're looking at and keeping an eye on is, if you see a bunch of, I don't think I have too many parts of it here anymore, parts that have a straight line, right? I mean, you're probably not going to have very many segments, but it's the curve that, the fact that these points are helping define the curve is why they're there. When we add these points out, it's going to give us a straight line, and they're not really doing anything, but that is okay. So we've been able to do a little bit here. I'm going to go ahead and weld or optimize everything just to make sure. Now, optimize what it does if you've never done it. Gets rid of polygons, unused point, or will weld polygons, points, get rid of unused points, and it will use a tolerance. Now, I believe the default is actually 0.001, but I don't have a problem with using 0.01 since, that's still pretty small. So now we have some extra points to add here, and we have to be careful because we need to add them, not just, that's weird, like not just on this polygon, but also down the side as well. And line cut doesn't always do that. So for instance, I would come here and do line cut. Now, if I kind of go like this and kind of slice, it should go all the way down. And in fact, it looks like it did. If I don't go all the way down, there are maybe something like this. It is possible it doesn't go all the way down. So we definitely want to double check as we're going. That looks like it did in fact work. And so we're going to do that, say there, here, and we are creating unnecessary polygons here. We are also making sure our object has four-sided polygons because those will subdivide a lot easier when it comes to sculpting or using deformers, even displacement in a material. Okay, all right. That looks pretty good. I've added all these polygons, although I thought I did. It doesn't look like it added all of those lines, so I will do my best to make these straight. And this is where going back to a top view, making sure everything is lined up can be helpful just to make our lives a little bit easier. All right, I think that's all of them. Great. And it's going to be hard to see those ones that are a bit off. So if we find them, we'll fix them. If not, we'll move on. Now, the next step here is to kind of equally distribute these a little bit better. We're not going to be able to completely do that. But once again, if I bring back my final version and get rid of the sculpt so you can see the original mesh, you can see that I did go back in here and space these out a little bit more. Same with those as well, though not 100%. We don't have to be 100% perfect with this. It certainly looks nicer, but very few people, if any, will see the wireframe on the end result. And this really just comes down to sliding. So I'll do it a little bit, but once again, it does get kind of repetitive. So I don't want to, do it for the entire part here. So I'm going to start sliding, saying that's about half, and then go, oh, there's the bottom one, snap it, go back to my slide tool. Oops, I thought I hit it. And say that looks like it's in the middle, and then snap this one over, and it just becomes very repetitive here. Okay, so that looks good. And that looks pretty close to halfway. Just kind of eyeballing it here. Boy, my snap is just really kind of getting in my way since it just will not move. So that looks good. Pretty close. And you get the point. There's a few of these. Maybe I'll continue to slide. But really, that is the hard part. Maybe this one as well, and then we'll move on. That's too far, actually. Fun. It almost made me think that I'm missing a point. The way this kind of bends the wrong way. Yep, right here. So we'll do that and go into our top view here. See that it wasn't quite where it needed to be. And so that's looking pretty good, and hopefully you get the idea. Once again, doesn't need to be perfect, really comes down to what you're trying to do, what the end result's going to be. I would clean up this stuff a little bit. So you can see we have 2 points here. I really don't need that, so I'll weld those. In fact, I'll even weld all these points together to say right here. And then just kind of connect the two sides a little bit. So line cut again, something like that, line cut. And even if there are these edges here, I know I'm not going to keep all of them, but we'll just do something like that. Select those edges. And then, oops, I thought I could just toggle back to weld, but I can't. Weld those. And I'm just kind of adding these lines where I need in order to get four-sided polygons. At least try. And this is interesting because if we go to our top view here, you'll see it's kind of a weird section here where you would think it would have placed an edge already, but it's just really a bent polygon. And so sometimes you can run into issues where it doesn't want to cut a bent polygon, at least from a top view. Let's see, I think, nope, we have that there. And I can clean up these edges now, those kind of diagonal edges, back to my brush selection by dissolving them. There we go. And then once again, I could use slide, which all the way at the bottom. Nope, now it's moved. Actually, go into point. There we go. Slide, maybe that. So it's close to straight. And there we go. That's looking pretty good. Now I would do the same thing over here that we just did there. I did the more complicated side, so you would get the idea. Same thing with this. It's the same as what we've done with the top here and the bottom. So at this point, we're done with the modeling part of this. Okay, so what I'm going to do is switch over to the finished version, but without kind of the sculpting and deformers on it. So we can kind of see the process I went through with that. Now with the P here, the letter P, there we go. I did something a little bit different. Okay, so with this one, this is kind of the cleaned up version. And you know, in a perfect world, we'd be able to add edge loops to these polygons, doing something like this, and it would go all the way around. And in fact, had we, you know, cut this a little bit better, had these lines go, you know, down instead of just straight across, it would be easier to add these edge loops, but that's ideally what we would want in order to make the polygons more the same size overall. Now, one thing you can try to make polygons the same size, or to add more polygons, I should say, and it's what I've done here a few times to the letter P, is to just subdivide. Okay, this is kind of like smoothing, adding a subdivision surface, but if you uncheck smooth subdivision, it just adds the lines. And so you could see if I add 2, you know, we do get some lines, but you start to get a little bit of weirdness here in the corners. Okay, and maybe that's okay, because it probably isn't going to affect, you know, the geometry too much. Now, one thing I haven't talked about with these is the Phong shading, and that's going to play a big part in the way this looks, because if you go really high with the Phong shading, like I think 60 is pretty normal, you can see we get a very kind of smooth shaded with a few minor issues here and there. Okay. And obviously if you're doing like a hard bevel like this, that's not going to be what you want. And so we want to work with our Phong angle till we get something that looks pretty good, just turning it down. Okay. And even something like that, right? Not 100% perfect. We can keep going lower and lower. At some point though, if we turn it too low, we'll start to get faceting in places we don't want. So an alternative is to break the Phong shading yourself. And I won't do this for all of it, but let's see how much of a loop I can get here. So maybe something like this. Okay, that edge loop going all the way around. What I can do is select it, right click, and actually right click further up so we can see this. And I'm going to choose break Phong shading. And that is going to break the Phong shading. And now we have that hard edge going all the way around. And if I was going to do it manually, I'd probably also do it for this section up top here. Maybe the section down here. All right. But I don't want to get into that too much because I do think, you know, around 30 or so seems to work pretty good. Okay. So I think that's what I'll keep it at with this particular example. But once again, depending on exactly what you're doing, it could be different. So the next step now is to add more polygons for whatever you're trying to do, whether it is to use a deformer, whether it is to sculpt. All right. And I'll quickly kind of go over both approaches here to kind of get like almost like a bent, you know, part of the bevel, since that's what I showed earlier. So for a deformer, you know, I can use something like a displacer, which is not all that different than say using a displacement map. And in this, I'm going to add a noise Okay, and you can see how it's going crazy here. Now, one of the things I don't like about the displacer is that you don't have a lot of control over the direction it's displacing. It's kind of just pushing something in and out based on the vertex normal, and that's it. You can't say not on the x-axis, not on the y or z or anything like that. But if we turn down the strength, you can see we start to get something that maybe could work. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Now, the one downside of this approach is we still have very, very hard edge bevels. And as you'll see when we kind of go the sculpting approach here, that's, something we can change. So I'm going to switch to the sculpt layout here. And now when I go to sculpt this, rather than just click subdivide here, because that will smooth it, okay? Or at least it should. I think I've already turned off this setting that I wanted to check. And that is in the smoothness here. Before you click on that, set this to 0. Because if you have this at the default 100 and then start subdividing this, you're going to get some really weird results, especially if you don't have 100% correct edge flow, four-sided polygons, all that fun stuff. So that's where having that smoothness set to 0 helps. It's still going to shade it a little, right? Adjust the shading. It does soften it up a bit. But for the most part, it keeps our hard edges. And how hard those edges are really come down to the spacing between these polygons. You can see these edges at the top here are much, or I shouldn't say much, but are a little bit harder because there's more polygons closer to it, whereas this main edge is a little bit softer. And that's the whole point of going through this process is we don't want a whole bunch of polygons in one area and a lot less in another. And so we did okay here with this, but there's still plenty of room for improvement. And honestly, once you have something like this, maybe this might be something that works a little bit better going into a remesher, okay? Just to kind of continue the process and take it, that much further. All right, that's looking pretty good, but, there we go. We have some weirdness. So, not a bad start with what we did, but like I said, still plenty of room to improve. We'll pretend though everything's looking good. And I do like that, it does kind of soften that bevel just a little bit. And honestly, if I was going to do it this way to the one letter, I should be doing it this way to the other. But I'm trying to go over all the different options and techniques for doing this, because even with this super hard bevel, we could perhaps fix this in our material by using the rounded corners, and maybe we'll give that a look here shortly. But at this point, I would just sculpt and come in here, and all I did was use grab, and I'm going to use my middle mouse button to change the size, maybe, of my brush. There we go. Is my middle mouse button freaking out on me? It is. So I'll just change it here, and you can kind of see it. Now, make sure you have the correct object selected. That would help. There it is. And man, that's really gonna bug me that I can't change the brush size or very easily. Usually what you should be able to do is click the middle mouse in and then move it left or right. I don't know if I have a setting or a button stuck somewhere, but all I did was come in here and just kind of push and pull this to bend it around, make it imperfect. And this is just something that you really can't do unless you get in here and sculpt this yourself. All right, so something like this is all I did going through here. I'm just trying to do it quickly. I'm trying to be very careful with where I click and click towards the top. And I would be changing the size quite a bit as well, making sure that my brush is a little bit smoother. I'm sorry, smaller, I should say, for those smaller parts. But just coming in here, grabbing parts of this. There we go. That's what I was expecting to happen. Just kind of doing something, like this. Not too hard, not too difficult, trying to not spend too much time doing this, but hopefully you get the idea. All right, so we end up with something maybe similar here, whereas the displacer does it all over. I have a little bit more control sculpting and doing it kind of this part. So that's it for the modeling step. Now for the lighting, the materials part. So just so everybody knows where I'm at with this, I do have a dome light with an HDRI. This is one from the asset browser, Studio 21. It's like my go-to here. I have a ground plane with just, a black material where I used one of the imperfection maps in the roughness. Let's get rid of that gold material for now and start from scratch, creating a new material. And I'm just going to apply it to my null, so it applies to both objects inside. And you can see right away, kind of how this looks, how it breaks up the shape and just adds a little bit more detail. And this can be a great way to, once again, not just for beveled text, but for anything that has a hard edge that you want to add imperfections, irregularities to, like a blade, a sword, knife, that type of thing. So this is looking pretty good. And we can start just by adding the rounded corners, just so we can see what that looks like. More for the second letter, but just in case, as this is a nice way to help smooth out hard edges just a bit, just softening them. And I can connect this directly to the bump map. And that does add a lot of softness here, which I actually like quite a bit, even on the letter H here. So that helps kind of make these look a little bit more similar, right? And so if the displacement or displacer deformer is going to be good enough, then yeah, that's working good. To turn this into gold, metalness to 1, change our base color here to, gold, right? We're starting to get pretty close. I used an imperfection map. I don't remember which one. Start searching for imperfection. I think it was like a scratches, something like this. Ought to be just fine. And I'm going to put that into the reflection roughness. All right, since that didn't seem to do a whole lot. Yeah, contrast is pretty low there. I like to use a ramp. If you've seen any of my other videos, this technique is something you've seen me do before. Drop a ramp in that connection. And then I can use this almost like a levels to help with the values here. So I'm going to darken up those, but I need to make sure I'm soloing the ramp. Okay, I think I did that too much, but also bring back some of the brighter values as well. All right, maybe something like, there we go. Like that. Each one of these is a little bit different, the imperfection maps, in terms of what you can do with a ramp before things start to break down. That looks pretty good. I still may want a little bit more of some brighter values. Yeah, something like that. Looks pretty good. Another big part of what I did with this, though, and I'll disconnect the roughness ramp for right now, is I used what was it called? Texture, curvature. And this allows you to highlight curvature and work with it just that. So if I plug this, honestly, it doesn't matter where, but just base color so we can see it. You can see it's highlighting a lot of the curvature, a lot of the edges here. And there are ways you can take this even further. I've done a video on the curvature node, I believe, mixing this with a noise or an imperfection map so you don't end up with perfectly hard edges here. But essentially the radius is going to determine how wide that curvature, that brighter part is, and you can tell it what mode you want to work to, whether convex or concave. Concave being kind of bent inward. This is kind of bent outward. And then the radius is how far. Now, I wish the radius allowed you to do a little bit more with this, because as I start to get larger, it starts to get softer. It starts to kind of fade away pretty quickly. But you can see that, honestly, it's actually not terrible. Maybe something like 1.5 to make this a little bit more noticeable. And then once again, if I'm not 100% happy with those values, I can use a ramp to exaggerate them. So I wish I'd connected that ramp or dragged it on top, but the curvature goes into the alternate input. The out here can go to our base color. And then, I can bring in the brighter values to emphasize those more, brighten them up. That's looking pretty good. And you can notice, really how much more curved the edges are on the sculpted one versus the one with the deformer. So while they look pretty similar with the material on, the edges themselves are more different than you might initially think. Now to get the gold color back, I would just add, keep clicking around, the colors into our ramp. So for the black, that would actually be our gold color. And there are probably better ways of doing this, maybe using like a color mix. So that's you're using the curvature as a mask, but using the ramp to colorize this works as well. You can see now it's making those edges much brighter, maybe even too bright, but we'll keep them for now. And then connect the reflection roughness in there as well. And that's pretty much it. I mean, I did use this in this imperfection or an imperfection in the bump map as well. If I was going to use this rounded corners, I would use something like a bump map blender so I could use both of those. But essentially, I think that's about it. So that will do it for this one. If there's anything else you would like to see, please leave me a comment down below. And if you found this video helpful, I'd appreciate it if you could like it as well as subscribe to the channel. Until next time, take care.